Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me for day 14 of the countdown to Christmas story time. Today, as promised, I'm going to read two German stories to you. The first one is probably very well known as it is by the Brothers Grimm, and it is called The Elves and the Shoemaker. I hope you enjoy. There was once a shoemaker who worked very hard and was very honest, but still he could not earn enough to live upon, and at last all he had in the world was gone, save just leather enough to make one pair of shoes. Then he cut this leather out, all ready to make up the next day, meaning to rise early in the morning to his work. His conscience was clear and his heart light amidst all his troubles, so he went peaceably to bed, left all his cares to heaven, and soon fell asleep. In the morning, after he had said his prayers, he sat himself down to his work, when, to his great wonder, there stood shoes already made upon the table. The good man knew not what to say or think at such an odd thing happening. He looked at the workmanship. There was not one false stitch in the whole job. All was neat and true, that it was quite a masterpiece. The same day a customer came in, and the shoes suited him so well that he willingly paid a price higher than usual for them, and the poor shoemaker with the money bought leather enough to make 2 pairs more. In the evening he cut out the work and went to bed early, that he might get up and begin betimes next day. But he was saved all the troubles, for when he got up in the morning the work was done, ready to his hand. Soon in came buyers, who paid him handsomely for his goods, so that he bought leather enough for 4 pairs more. He cut out the work again overnight, and found it done in the morning, as before, and so it went on for some time. What was got ready in the evening was always done by daybreak, and the good man soon became thriving and well off again. One evening about Christmas time, as he and his wife were sitting over the fire chatting together, he said to her, "I should like to sit up and watch tonight, that we may see who it is that comes and does my work for me." The wife liked the thought, so they left a light burning and hid themselves in a corner of the room, behind a curtain that was hung up there, and watched what would happen. As soon as it was midnight, there came in 2 little naked dwarfs, and they set themselves upon the shoemaker's bench, took up all the work that was cut out, and began to ply with their little fingers, stitching and rapping and tapping away at such a rate that the shoemaker was all wonder and could not take his eyes off them. And on they went till the job was quite done, and the shoes stood ready for use upon the table. This was long before daybreak, and then they bustled away as quick as lightning. The next day the wife said to the shoemaker, "These little wights have made us rich, and we ought to be thankful to them, and do them a good turn if we can. I am quite sorry to see them run round about as they do, and indeed it is not very decent, for they have nothing upon their backs to keep off the cold. I'll tell you what, I'll make each of them a shirt, and a coat and waistcoat, and a pair of pantaloons into the bargain. And do you make each of them a little pair of shoes." The thought pleased the good cobbler very much, and one evening, when all the things were ready, they laid them out on the table, instead of the work they used to cut out, and then went and hid themselves to watch what the little elves would do. About midnight in they came dancing and skipping, hopped around the room, and then went to sit down to their work as usual, but when they saw the clothes lying around for them, they laughed and chuckled and seemed mightily delighted. Then they dressed themselves in the twinkling of an eye, and danced and capered and sprang about as merry as could be, till at last they danced out of the door and away over the greens. The good couple saw them no more, but everything went well for them from the time forward as long as they lived. Okay, so this was the first one. I guess that is one of the best known Christmas stories of German origin. Um, I found another one, and I'm not entirely sure who wrote this down like this, but it's another shoemaker story, and it is supposed to be based on German folklore. I have to admit I'm not familiar with it at all. But yeah, let's believe the internet, shall we? So this story is simply called Fritz, Franz and Frederick, and those are three German names. So let's see. Once upon a time, very near Christmas, in a little German town, there lived a cobbler and his three sons, Fritz, Franz and Frederick. Now, the cobbler, who was a very fine cobbler, worried this year because no one had bought enough shoes to provide enough money for him to buy Christmas presents for his sons. And the cobbler sat down one night and told his sons that this had been a very bad year. There would be no Christmas for the cobbler's family this year. Now, Frederick, who was the oldest boy, understood, and Franz, who was the middle boy, understood. But Fritz didn't understand at all, and he cried and cried and cried. The cobbler still tried to explain that perhaps just on Christmas Eve some very rich person would come along and buy a pair of shoes, or maybe 2 pairs of shoes, and it wouldn't be too late to buy some fruits and nuts. Maybe some very rich person would. Well, that seemed to settle little Fritz for a while. But days passed and no one came into the cobbler's shop. Finally, on Christmas Eve, the cobbler knew he had to do something for his three sons. So he went to the stove and made some wheat cakes, 3 nice-sized wheat cakes, and sprinkled sugar on top of each of them. He couldn't help but drop a tear on each wheat cake, for he knew that this was a very, very poor gift for his sons, even if this was all he could do. But just as he finished the cakes and placed them on top of the stove to cool, there was a knock upon the door. The cobbler rushed to the door and opened it. Standing in the door was a messenger. "My lady needs your services, cobbler. She has lost the string of her dancing shoes, and you must come and measure them and replace them quickly, for the Nutcracker is playing at the palace tonight, and the royal family will be there." Now, the cobbler knew that replacing the strings of dancing shoes would at least bring him a few coppers. He might be able to buy fruit and nuts for his three sons. Oh, he hated to leave them on this Christmas Eve, but it was his job, so he knew he had to leave them to eat their wheat cakes alone and do what he had to do. Turning to his sons, he kissed each of them upon the forehead and told them he had to be away for an hour or so. "Eat your wheat cakes and get into bed. Be careful," he cautioned them, "and open the door for no one while I'm gone, for I've heard there are wolves about." And with that the cobbler left with the messenger. The evening passed, and Frederick and Franz decided it was time to go to bed, so Frederick handed each of his brothers a wheat cake their father had made. He had sprinkled them with sugar to add a little sweetness to their Christmas. But suddenly, while they were eating, they heard a strange tapping at the door. Tat, 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 tat. "What is that?" Fritz said. "Do you suppose that's the wolf at the door?" "Good heavens, no!" Franz said. "Wolves don't knock." Then they each heard the tapping again and again, even louder. Tat, 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 tat. Fritz started to cry. "It's the wolf!" he cried. "It's the wolf! I know, it must be the wolf at the door." "Stop crying," said Frederick. "I will look out the window and see who it is." And Frederick ran to the window and looked out. Through the window he could see, standing in front of the door, a very, very short little man with a long grey beard that brushed the ground. Upon the little man's head was a little pointed hat. As Frederick stood in the window, the little man looked up towards him and yelled in a strange little voice, "Will you open this door? I am cold." Frederick was so frightened he forgot all about his father's instructions to open for no one, and before he knew, he had opened the door. And in rushed the little man with a whirl of sleet and snow. Oh, was he a strange one! He wore funny little pointed shoes, and his eyes kind of glistened, and his little fingers were long and pointed, and as he looked about the house, his little fingers just tinkled like little bells, and the little hat that twirled around on the top of his head as he swung his wee small body from side to side, shedding the sleet and snow on the floor. "Why didn't you let me in sooner?" demanded the little man. "I told you I was cold." "Oh, I'm so sorry," said Frederick. "We didn't know who you were." And poor little Frederick still didn't know who the little man was, but he seemed so cold and so old, Frederick thought he had to let him in. "Stand over by the stove," Frederick said, "and get warm." So the men rushed over and threw every stick into the fire. It was all the wood they had for a long winter's night, but the fire burned brightly. "I am hungry," demanded the little man. "Give me those sweet cakes." Frederick handed the little man what was left of his wheat cake, and the little man gobbled it all down. Then, without so much as a please or thank you, he grabbed the cake from Franz and wolfed it down too. But when he took that cake from poor little Fritz, he cried and cried. So the little man looked at Fritz. "Hush crying," he commanded, "and go to bed." Fritz quickly ran towards the bed and jumped in, and the little man watched as Fritz pulled the blankets over his head as if to hide. The little man said to Fritz, "That bed looks comfortable. I think I like to sleep there." And with that the little man jumped into bed with Fritz, and he twisted and turned and grabbed the blanket all for himself. "Here, here," the little man said. "It's cold in this bed. Come, keep me warm. Franz, Frederick, come, keep me warm." So Franz and Frederick climbed into bed with Fritz and the little man, and all three boys cuddled and huddled with the strange little creature still clutching the blanket for himself. "Oh," said the little man, "it's too crowded in here. You, Frederick, you're the big one. You get out, go over by the fireplace and stand on your head." Frederick, who was beginning to get a little tired of the little man's demands, walked slowly over to the fireplace and stood on his head. As he did, he heard something falling from his pocket. When he looked to the floor, there all around him were nuts and candy spread all over the floor, walnuts and pecans, gumdrops and lemon pops, candy canes and chocolate nougats. They had fallen from his very own pockets. "Aha!" said the little man. "You boys are holding out on me. You, Franz, go, stand on your head. You probably have something in your pocket too." As the second son stood on his head, he too heard something fall from his pockets, and there all around him on the floor were oranges and apples and plums and wonderful fruits. "He he he he!" cackled the little man. "You too had something hidden in your pockets. You, Fritz, get out of the bed, stand on your head in the corner." But poor little Fritz was so little he could not stand on his head, and he was so frightened he was trembling. Finally his brothers grabbed his legs, and down went his head and up went his feet. As he stood on his head in the corner, as the little man told him to do, suddenly from Fritz's pocket fell great big gold coins. They fell and fell and fell. They scrambled across the floor to fill their pockets, but that's when the three boys realized the little man who had entered their humble home that night must be the Christmas elf. So they turned to thank him, but he was gone. They looked all around and everywhere, but the little man with the long gray beard that touched the ground, and eyes that glistened, and fingers that tingled like tiny bells was gone. But oh, the nuts and candies and fruits and most wonderful kinds of the most wonderful kinds, and all the gold coins were still there on the floor, just where they had fallen from the boys' pockets. When their father came home, he couldn't believe his eyes. What miracle had taken place? Frederick explained. "It was the Christmas elf, father. He said he met you once when you fixed his shoes for free. He told you that your kindness would be rewarded 1,000-fold. And that is what happened a long, long time ago, when Fritz, Franz, and Frederick and the cobbler himself had the best Christmas they had ever known." So there you have it. The first one, a German Christmas story for sure. The second one, I don't exactly know. Thank you again for listening to my second day of reading Christmas stories to you. I hope you enjoyed these two, and will come back tomorrow when I have two more of German origin. And yeah, have a great day, have a great week, and I hope you will be with me tomorrow. Bye, guys.